The library was always my refuge. The smell of old books, the soft carpeted floors, and the faint echo of footsteps made it feel like a world separate from everything else. At 24, studying literature was supposed to be routine, but somehow the routine had a pulse the moment she walked in. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, her presence graceful and deliberate. Her lightly tanned skin carried subtle freckles, and soft laugh lines traced around her dark brown eyes, giving her a warm, lived-in elegance. The librarian wore a fitted cream blouse tucked into a navy pencil skirt that hinted at a curvy figure and confident posture, but without ostentation. Everything about her was calm, measured, but the quiet strength she carried made her magnetic. Our first encounter was innocuous. I approached her desk to ask about a rare poetry volume. She looked up over her glasses, eyes briefly meeting mine, and I felt something stir in my chest. She smiled faintly, a slight tilt of her head that suggested both amusement and mild warning. "Looking for this?" she asked, guiding me through the labyrinth of shelves. Her voice was low, smooth, and confident, carrying a subtle warmth that made the air between us feel heavier than it should have in a quiet library. As she led me through the rows of books, I noticed the gentle sway of her hair, the precise, graceful movements of her hands when she picked up a volume. Every step she took felt like a rhythm I wasn't supposed to hear, but couldn't ignore. She moved around the shelves like someone in complete control of her space. And yet, there was a softness, a quiet vulnerability in the way her eyes flicked toward mine before she quickly returned to the task at hand. "Eyes on the titles, not the librarian," she teased quietly, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. The words weren't flirtatious in the typical sense, but the subtle lilt in her voice made them feel like an invitation or a challenge. I pretended to read the spines of the books, though the words blurred as my gaze kept drifting toward her. She paused once, straightened her glasses, and looked at me over the rim. There was an unspoken question in her gaze, curiosity wrapped in authority, and I felt exposed, like she could see past the surface to thoughts I didn't even know I had. Then, with a soft sigh, she turned and continued shelving books, leaving me frozen, caught in a moment I didn't want to end. By the time I returned the book and walked away, the faint rustle of her pages and the distant echo of her steps lingered in my mind. The library was still quiet, but something had shifted. A silent tension, subtle and unspoken, had settled between us, a delicate thread of curiosity, attraction, and intrigue that promised the routine I knew so well was about to be rewritten. Even in that first encounter, I realized this wasn't just about asking for a book. Something about her made the quiet library feel alive, and I knew, with a mix of awe and unease, that I'd be coming back for the books, for the quiet, and for her. After that first encounter, I found myself returning to the library more often than strictly necessary. The excuse was always legitimate: research papers, late-night study sessions, or hunting for obscure editions. But the real reason was always the same: to see her. She noticed, of course. There was no missing the way her dark brown eyes tracked my movements across the quiet aisles. She never called attention to it outright, but the subtle shift in her tone when she addressed me was unmistakable, slightly warmer, slightly softer, with just the hint of a teasing edge. Sometimes she left small notes tucked into books she'd set aside for me. "You might enjoy this one, or try the last chapter. It's worth it." They were casual, almost innocent gestures, but the weight behind them made my chest tighten. During these study sessions, I began to notice the nuances of her presence. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Latina woman this time. Her long black hair always neatly tied back, soft laugh lines and faint freckles catching the light as she moved. She carried herself with a confident poise, her curves accentuated by a fitted blouse and pencil skirt, but the warmth in her gestures revealed the quiet vulnerability underneath. Her lightly tanned skin glowed in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, and her dark brown eyes held an intelligence tempered with humor, a mixture that both intimidated and fascinated me. Our conversations expanded naturally, from literature to life, from favorite authors to personal philosophies. I learned about her past, a former teaching career cut short by circumstance, a failed marriage that left her cautious but not closed off, and a love for the quiet rhythm of the library that was almost ritualistic. I spoke cautiously at first, feeling the distance imposed by our age difference, but she listened, really listened, as if every word mattered. There was no condescension, no pity, only a deep attentiveness that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't before. The small touches started to accumulate, subtle but electric. Passing books across the desk meant our hands brushed. Correcting a posture or pointing to a shelf brought her close enough that the warmth of her body became a faint, lingering sensation. Once, as I reached for a book just out of reach, she stepped behind me, her shoulder brushing mine. Her voice was soft, teasing, tall enough to reach, but not quite. That single moment left my heart hammering, every sense alert to the quiet intimacy between us. Even the mundane, her arranging books, jotting notes, or reviewing catalog cards, became hypnotic. The faint scent of vanilla and old paper clung to her, mingling with the soft rustle of pages and the hum of fluorescent lights. It was impossible not to notice, impossible not to be drawn in. And then there were the glances, fleeting, lingering, unspoken. When our eyes met across the aisles, the library's calm transformed into a charged space, where every small movement carried meaning. I realized that these study sessions weren't about the books anymore. They were about the moments we shared, the quiet connection that neither of us dared name aloud, but both of us felt deep down. By the end of these weeks, the library was no longer a place of solitude. It had become a stage for something far more complicated, a delicate, slow-burning intimacy between a 24-year-old student and a 40-year-old woman who held both authority and allure in her calm, graceful presence. It started on a rainy evening when the library was nearly empty. The usual hum of pages and quiet conversation replaced by the soft tapping of raindrops against the tall windows. I lingered in the aisles, pretending to browse a shelf of classic novels, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. She moved with her usual grace, collecting returned books, her long black hair brushing against her shoulders, her 40-year-old Latina elegance illuminated by the soft glow of the library lights. Her dark brown eyes, usually calm and composed, seemed sharper tonight, aware of every glance I stole. When I approached to return my book, she didn't take it immediately. Instead, she let her fingers linger on the spine a second longer than necessary, her body angled slightly closer. "Do you always stay this late?" she asked softly, her voice a low murmur that somehow carried more weight than the empty room around us. "Only when there's something worth staying for." I replied carefully, unsure if I was crossing a line. The words felt both reckless and truthful. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, and she leaned slightly closer. "Careful," she whispered. "Flattery isn't allowed past 9 o'clock." The teasing tone in her voice carried a quiet intensity that made the air between us feel electric, even as the rain pattered against the glass behind her. The clock ticked somewhere above us, but time seemed irrelevant. When she reached for the book, our fingers brushed, and instead of recoiling, neither of us moved away. The touch was brief, yet it carried a spark that neither of us could ignore. My pulse quickened, and the warmth of her hand lingered in my memory, even after she withdrew. Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the rain. "You're breaking the first rule already." I blinked, caught between exhilaration and apprehension. "What rule?" "Silence and self-control," she replied, her gaze steady, unflinching. Her dark brown eyes locked onto mine, a mixture of amusement, authority, and something else I couldn't quite name. The subtle shift in her demeanor, the softness in her expression, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head, spoke volumes more than the words themselves. For a long moment, we simply stood there, the quiet library around us fading into irrelevance. The scent of her perfume, a delicate mix of vanilla and jasmine, mingled with the faint aroma of aged paper and ink. Every movement she made, the way she adjusted a stack of books, the graceful tilt of her shoulders, seemed magnified, intentional, and intimate. Finally, she stepped back, maintaining the composed poise of the librarian, but the sparkle in her eyes betrayed the calm facade. "Good night," she whispered, her lips curling into that familiar, teasing smile. And then she walked away, leaving me standing there, heart hammering, fully aware that the rules had already been broken, not just by me, but by her. The evening ended, but the sensation lingered. A single, seemingly innocent touch had opened a door neither of us knew how to close, and the tension that had been simmering quietly for weeks now burned brightly, undeniable and intoxicating. I left the library that night knowing, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that nothing would ever be the same again. The following week, I returned to the library earlier than usual, heart racing before I even stepped inside. The memory of that rainy evening haunted me. The way her hand had brushed mine, the subtle, charged smile she'd given before stepping back into composure. Today, I needed answers, or at least the courage to face what I was feeling. She was there, as always, arranging new arrivals in the far back aisle. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair cascading softly over her shoulders, her dark brown eyes glinting with quiet amusement. The faint laugh lines around her eyes gave her a warmth that made the strictness of her librarian role feel softer, more human. Her lightly tanned skin caught the morning light filtering through the high windows, and her tailored beige blouse and olive skirt gave her an elegant, graceful presence. Even amidst the rows of books, she seemed to command the space without effort. I approached slowly, holding a book, trying to seem casual. "I'm returning this," I said, though I could feel my hands trembling slightly. She didn't look up immediately. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, voice soft but edged with a caution that made my stomach tighten. "I'm just returning a book," I replied, placing it carefully on the shelf beside her. "Then leave it at the desk," she said, finally glancing up, her dark eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker in her gaze, hesitation, something unspoken, a crack in the calm facade she always maintained. I stepped closer, emboldened by weeks of small touches, fleeting glances, and quiet conversations. "You said I was breaking rules," I whispered. "What about you?" Her eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability. "Maybe I already am," she admitted, her voice low, almost a sigh. She reached to adjust a stack of books, but her hand lingered near mine, the space between us charged with a tension neither could ignore. The world around us seemed to vanish. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the distant footsteps of a late-night student, the whisper of pages, all became a backdrop to the quiet electricity in the aisle. The scent of her perfume, vanilla mixed with a hint of jasmine, enveloped me. I could feel her warmth even without touching her, a magnetic pull that made the library feel impossibly small, impossibly intimate. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned closer, her lips curling into a teasing, almost conspiratorial smile. "Shh, keep quiet while I break the rules with you," she whispered. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a declaration. But the weight behind her words, the deliberate softness in her voice, and the way she held herself, so close yet so composed, made it clear that she was offering something forbidden, something dangerous, and yet utterly irresistible. The moment stretched a quiet, suspended heartbeat between us. Her eyes searched mine, seeking acknowledgement, consent, and maybe something I couldn't yet name. And for the first time, I understood that the rules weren't meant to keep us apart. They were meant to heighten the gravity of what we were about to explore. As she stepped back, restoring the calm of the aisle, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. The line had been crossed, subtly, quietly, irrevocably. The library was no longer just a place of study. It had become the stage for something intoxicating, something neither of us could resist. After the whispered confession in the stacks, An invisible tension settled over the library. Each visit became a careful dance of proximity and restraint. I found myself lingering by the aisles, pretending to browse, but always aware of her presence nearby. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Latina woman with long black hair falling in sleek waves down her back, her dark brown eyes carrying both warmth and caution. Her lightly tanned skin glowed under the bright library lights, and subtle laugh lines framed her expressive face, hinting at her mature beauty and calm confidence. Yet despite the allure of our connection, she began to distance herself. Brief glances replaced lingering ones. Short replies replaced soft teasing, and she kept her movements deliberate, careful. The warmth that had drawn me in weeks ago was now tempered by caution. I could feel the hesitation radiating from her, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary she was trying to maintain. The library, once a sanctuary of quiet intimacy, now felt charged with unspoken rules, like every glance and gesture carried weight. One evening, unable to resist the pull, I stayed past closing hours. The library was nearly empty, the overhead lights casting a soft glow over the aisles. Books lined the shelves in neat rows, but I was focused on her. The curve of her shoulders as she arranged new arrivals, the faint brush of her long black hair against her neck as she leaned down to pick up a fallen volume. She noticed me approaching, her eyes locking with mine, a mixture of surprise, caution, and something I couldn't quite name. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, her voice low, almost fearful. I couldn't leave without saying something, I admitted, holding the book I'd come to return. "I can't stop thinking about what happened." Her breath hitched slightly, a subtle but telling reaction. "You make me forget myself," she confessed, her dark brown eyes glistening in the soft light. "And that's dangerous." We sat together at a nearby table, the quiet hum of the library surrounding us. The air was filled with the scent of old paper, ink, and her faint vanilla perfume. She didn't look away. Instead, she met my gaze with an intensity that made my chest ache. "I've spent my life following rules," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe it's time I remember what it feels like to break one for myself." Her honesty struck me. The vulnerability beneath her composed exterior, the admission that she was just as human, just as drawn in as I was. It was a rare glimpse into the woman behind the librarian's authority, a moment that made every careful glance, every subtle touch, every whispered word between us make sense. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing hers on the tabletop. The contact was brief, gentle, and deliberate, charged with years of restraint broken in an instant. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand rested lightly against mine, a silent agreement that the connection between us was real, inevitable, and worth the risk. That night, as the rain continued to fall outside and the library emptied around us, we both understood. The rules were no longer barriers. They had become a frame for something deeper, something dangerous, thrilling, and impossible to ignore. And neither of us could turn back. The next day, the library felt different. The rows of books, the polished wooden tables, even the soft hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to hum with a quiet anticipation. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair falling straight and sleek past her shoulders. Her lightly tanned skin glowed in the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and the faint laugh lines at the corners of her dark brown eyes softened the confident poise she carried as a librarian. Today, her presence wasn't just authoritative. It was approachable, warm, and surprisingly vulnerable. I found her in the far back aisle, sorting through a stack of returned books. She glanced up as I approached, her eyes locking onto mine with a subtle mixture of curiosity and caution. "You're early," she said softly, almost hesitant. Her voice carried the faint scent of vanilla, blending with the aroma of paper and ink around us. "I couldn't wait," I admitted, my tone careful but honest. I needed to see you." Her gaze softened, and she set down the stack of books. Slowly, deliberately, She joined me at one of the quiet tables near the window. "I've thought a lot about last night," she confessed, her voice low, intimate. "Maybe we can't control how something begins, only how gently we handle it." There was a pause, the quiet punctuated only by the distant rustle of pages from other aisles. She placed her hand lightly on the table, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, but not so close as to be forward. Her touch was deliberate, comforting, and quietly inviting. The softness of her gesture contrasted with the strength of her presence, the confidence she carried even as she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. We really talked, for the first time about more than literature or library rules. She spoke of fear, of the years spent protecting her heart, of the loneliness that came with caution and independence. She described her failed marriage, not with bitterness, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to value herself and her peace above all else. I listened, not to solve anything, but to understand her, to meet her in the honesty she offered. Then she leaned slightly closer, her long black hair brushing the side of her face, and placed her hand over mine. The contact was gentle, tentative, but it carried a profound weight. "I trust you," she said softly, her dark brown eyes meeting mine with a clarity that took my breath away. And that's not something I give lightly. In that moment, all hesitation, all uncertainty melted away. The age difference, the unspoken rules, the fear of consequences, they faded into the background. What remained was trust, intimacy, and the quiet thrill of a connection that had been slowly building, now acknowledged and embraced. By the time we left the aisle, the world outside seemed a little brighter, a little softer. The library had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a bridge between two people learning to navigate desire, respect, and affection. And in her touch, her gaze, and her quiet words, I realized that the connection we had discovered wasn't fleeting. It was real, fragile, and infinitely precious. The turning point was clear. What had begun as subtle glances and accidental brushes of hands had blossomed into trust, a delicate, powerful bond that neither of us could deny, and neither of us would ever forget. By the time the semester drew to a close, the library had taken on a new significance. No longer just a place of study or refuge. It had become the backdrop for something quietly profound between us. She was 40 years old, a 40-year-old American Latino woman with long black hair flowing over her shoulders, dark brown eyes warm and expressive, and lightly tanned skin that caught the late afternoon light like a soft glow. Subtle freckles and faint laugh lines framed her face, highlighting a mature beauty that was both confident and approachable. Today, her posture was relaxed yet elegant, the tailored blouse and skirt she wore accentuating her graceful presence without a hint of pretension. The final day in the library felt suspended in time. We moved together through the aisles, stacking returned books and straightening shelves, each action deliberate, unhurried, and intimate in its own way. There were no rushed movements, no overt gestures, just a quiet rhythm of two people who had grown to understand each other. When our hands brushed, it no longer felt shocking or forbidden. It felt like a language we both knew fluently. The soft warmth of her fingers against mine spoke louder than any words could. When the last book was returned and the shelves stood perfectly arranged, we walked toward the exit. Outside, the golden evening sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long, warm shadows across the walkway. She paused by the door, long black hair catching the glow of the sun, and turned to me with a soft, knowing smile. "You made these halls louder than they've ever been," she said, her voice carrying gentle humor and affection. I smiled back, feeling the weight of unspoken words hanging comfortably between us. "And you made silence feel safe," I replied. My words were simple, but they carried everything that had been building for weeks. The tension, the curiosity, the quiet intimacy. She reached out instinctively, brushing a stray speck of dust from my shoulder. The touch was light, deliberate, and full of meaning. It was a small gesture, yet it encapsulated everything: trust, care, and the slow-burning connection we had nurtured. The air between us was thick with affection, yet remained entirely respectful, entirely human. No grand declarations were necessary. For a moment, we simply stood there, basking in the warmth of the late afternoon light and the quiet understanding that had developed between us. The library behind us was a monument to our journey, to the moments of silence, the fleeting touches, the shared glances, and the whispered words that had brought two unlikely hearts together. Finally, she turned to walk away, pausing only to offer one last smile. "Then maybe we both broke the right rules," she whispered, and with that, she moved down the walkway, her presence lingering like a gentle echo in my mind. I watched her go, the golden light painting her in a way that made her look timeless, graceful, and quietly radiant. The library, the whispered moments, the stolen glances, all of it had led to this simple, serene conclusion. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a story of passion or impulsive decisions. It was a story of connection, trust, and the quiet beauty of two souls discovering each other across boundaries, time, and age. As I turned away, the soft whisper of her words, "Shhh," lingered in my ears, a reminder that sometimes the most profound experiences are those lived quietly, fully, and with deliberate care. The story had reached its gentle resolution, leaving warmth in its wake, a subtle promise of more, but only in moments like these, when silence spoke louder than words ever could.